Sienna Dawson had seen all kinds of passengers in her 5 years as a flight attendant, businessmen barking orders into phones, honeymooners lost in their own world, and families juggling restless toddlers. But the man in 3A was different. She noticed him the moment he boarded, his sharp jawline tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in an expensive-looking navy suit, but there was something off about him. His green eyes darted around the cabin as if searching for an escape. As she made her way down the aisle, checking seat belts and securing overhead bins, she kept an eye on him. When the engines roared to life and the plane began to roll down the runway, his grip on the armrest tightened until his knuckles turned white. Sienna crouched beside his seat and offered her warmest smile. "First time flying?" she asked gently. The man let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not exactly, just not a fan of it." "Do you want me to talk you through it?" she offered. "I promise everything happening right now is completely normal." He exhaled sharply, as if debating whether to accept her help. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, that would be helpful." "The plane is accelerating to reach takeoff speed," she explained. "In a few seconds, you'll feel a slight tilt as we lift off. It might feel strange, but it's perfectly safe." He nodded again, but his body remained tense. Without thinking, Sienna reached out and gently placed her hand over his. The warmth of her touch made him glance at her sharply, but she didn't pull away. "Just breathe," she whispered. "You're okay." His fingers slowly uncurled, his grip loosening. He focused on her, his breathing evening out as the plane lifted into the sky. When they reached cruising altitude, Sienna gave his hand a final squeeze before pulling back. "See, you survived." He let out a breath, running a hand through his dark hair. "I guess I did," she smiled again. "Can I get you anything? Water, maybe?" "Actually." "Your name?" His voice was smoother now, more controlled, but there was something else in it, something intrigued. Sienna raised an eyebrow, but answered anyway. "Sienna Dawson." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Nice to meet you, Sienna." "I'm Callum Anderson." The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Before she could dwell on it, another passenger rang their call button, pulling her back to reality. "I'll check on you later, Callum," she said before heading down the aisle. But as she walked away, she could feel his gaze lingering on her. For the rest of the flight, Sienna found herself sneaking glances at 3A. Each time, she caught Callum watching her with an unreadable expression. During drink service, he accepted a glass of water with a murmured "thank you," his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. When turbulence hit midway through the flight, she noticed the way his grip tightened on the armrest again. Without hesitation, she returned to his side, leaning in close. "Still with me?" His jaw tensed, but he nodded. "Barely," Sienna smiled. "Close your eyes," she instructed. He hesitated, then did as she said. "Now take a deep breath and pretend you're somewhere else." "Somewhere you feel safe," he exhaled slowly. "That's not easy when I know I'm 35,000 feet in the air," she chuckled. "Fair enough, but you're safe, Callum, I promise." His eyes opened again, locking onto hers. For a moment, everything else faded, the hum of the engines, the chatter of passengers, even the slight tremor of turbulence. It was just the two of them. "Thank you, Sienna," he said softly. She swallowed, her heart doing an unexpected little flip. "Anytime." When the plane landed smoothly at JFK, Sienna went about her usual duties, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. As passengers disembarked, Callum lingered near his seat, waiting as others filed past. When he finally stepped into the aisle, he stopped in front of her. "I feel like I should repay you for keeping me sane during that flight." Sienna laughed lightly. "It's my job." Still, he pulled out a sleek black business card and pressed it into her palm. "Call me sometime." She glanced down at the card, her stomach doing an odd little flip when she read the name printed in bold letters. Callum Anderson, CEO, Anderson Enterprises. Her eyes snapped back up to his, wide with realization. "Wait, you're that Callum Anderson?" he chuckled. "Guilty?" She stared at him, stunned. Callum Anderson was one of New York's most successful entrepreneurs, known for turning a struggling tech company into a multi-million-dollar empire. and she had spent the entire flight treating him like an anxious first-time flyer. She started to speak, but he interrupted with a smirk. "You didn't know who I was, did you?" She shook her head, still speechless. "Good," he said, his voice quieter now, "because for once I liked being just Callum." Sienna felt her pulse quicken. There was something undeniably magnetic about him, something that made her want to know more. But before she could say another word, another passenger brushed past, reminding her she still had work to do. Callum took a step back, his gaze lingering on her one last time. "Don't forget to call me, Sienna." And then, just like that, he was gone. Sienna stared at the business card in her hand, her heart racing. She had comforted a nervous passenger, not knowing he was a millionaire, and now he wanted to see her again. Sienna stared at the business card long after Callum had disappeared into the sea of passengers. The neatly embossed letters mocked her with their significance. Callum Anderson, the man behind one of the most influential tech empires in the country. And yet, for the duration of their flight, he had simply been a nervous traveler clenching the armrest, hanging onto her words like they were his lifeline. The moment felt surreal, but before she could process it further, the cabin crew called her back to reality. There were post-flight duties to complete checking overhead bins, ensuring no belongings were left behind, and assisting with the transition for the next flight. By the time she stepped off the aircraft, the whirlwind of responsibilities had replaced her lingering thoughts of Callum Anderson. Almost. 3 days passed before she thought about the business card again. It remained tucked inside her wallet, untouched but not forgotten. The rational side of her argued there was no reason to call. What would she even say? "Hi, I comforted you on a flight, and you gave me your card, now what?" She scoffed at the thought. But the irrational part, the part that still felt the warmth of his hand beneath hers, the part that remembered the way he had looked at her when he said he liked being just Callum, wouldn't let it go. It wasn't until she was out with her best friend, Nora, that the subject came up again. They were at a small cafe nestled in the heart of Manhattan, sipping lattes as rush-hour traffic hummed outside. Nora, ever perceptive, noticed the way Sienna kept fiddling with the corner of her wallet. "All right, Spill, you've been acting weird since we sat down." Sienna hesitated but finally retrieved the card, sliding it across the table. Nora picked it up, her eyes widening as she processed the name. "Callum Anderson, as in the tech mogul?" Sienna nodded. "I met him on a flight. He was nervous about flying, and I helped him through it. At the end, he gave me his card." Nora's jaw nearly hit the table. "And you haven't called him?" "It's not that simple," Sienna muttered. "Why would a man like that be interested in talking to me again?" "Oh, I don't know," Nora said, tapping the card against her palm. "Maybe because you treated him like a normal human being, maybe because you were kind to him when he was vulnerable. Maybe because you're gorgeous and any man with functioning eyes would want to see you again." Sienna rolled her eyes. "Very subtle," Nora grinned. "I'm serious, what's the worst that could happen? He doesn't answer, he's busy, so what?" "At least you'll know." Sienna exhaled, staring at the card like it held all the answers. Finally, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number before she could talk herself out of it. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "This is Callum." For a split second, her mind blanked. Then she found her voice. "Hi, Callum, it's Sienna, from the flight." There was a pause, then a shift in his tone, something lighter, almost pleased. "Sienna, I was hoping you'd call." Something in her chest tightened at those words. "I wasn't sure if I should." "I'm glad you did," he said simply. "Are you free for dinner tonight?" She blinked. "Tonight? Unless you're busy." She wasn't, and even if she had been, she had a feeling she would have rearranged her entire schedule. "All right," she said. "Tonight." He gave her the name of an upscale restaurant in Midtown, a place she had only ever heard about in magazines. The kind of place where reservations were made months in advance, where celebrities dined behind velvet curtains. When she hung up, Nora was practically vibrating with excitement. "You have a date with Callum Anderson? Sienna, do you understand how insane that is?" "It's not a date," she said quickly. "It's just dinner." Nora gave her a pointed look. "It's dinner with a ridiculously successful, incredibly attractive man who clearly wants to see you again. Call it whatever you want, but it's something." Sienna had no argument for that. That evening, she stood in front of her closet, staring at her limited selection of dresses. She had never needed anything extravagant, and now, faced with the prospect of dining at a place where the cheapest item on the menu probably cost more than her entire grocery bill, she felt completely out of place. In the end, she chose a classic black dress, elegant but simple, and a pair of heels that had been worn exactly once before. It would have to do. When she arrived at the restaurant, she felt the weight of the luxurious surroundings pressing in on her. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the hushed conversations, and the waitstaff moved with an effortless grace that made her feel like an outsider. Then she saw him. Callum was seated at a private table near the window, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal strong forearms. He stood when he saw her, his gaze traveling over her in quiet appreciation. "You look beautiful," he said as she approached. Sienna felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, this place is a lot." His lips curved slightly. "I wanted to impress you." She raised an eyebrow. "I think you already did that when I found out who you were," he chuckled, gesturing for her to sit. "Fair point." As they settled into conversation, Sienna found herself surprised. She had expected stiff formality, rehearsed charm, the kind of polished demeanor men like him perfected for business meetings. But Callum was different. He asked about her life, her job, her travels. He listened, really listened, in a way that made her feel like she was the most important person in the room. And when he spoke about his own life, there was no arrogance, no self-importance. Just a man who had worked hard, who carried the weight of expectations on his shoulders, who despite all his success seemed genuinely interested in the woman sitting across from him. By the time dessert arrived, she realized something startling. She liked him, not because he was wealthy. Not because he was powerful, but because beneath all of that, he was just Callum. And something about that terrified her more than she cared to admit. Sienna hadn't expected to see Callum again so soon. But 2 days after their dinner, she stepped onto her next flight only to find him seated in first class, waiting for her. She stopped short, gripping the edge of a seat for balance as her heart gave an unsteady lurch. Callum looked completely at ease this time, one arm draped along the back of his seat, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He met her gaze with quiet amusement, as if he had been expecting her reaction. "I didn't take you for someone who flies commercial," she said, composing herself as she resumed her pre-flight checks. He lifted a shoulder in a casual shrug. "I don't usually. But I wanted to see you again." A flicker of something dangerous and thrilling ran through her, but she forced herself to stay professional. "You could have just called. I thought this would be more fun." His voice was smooth, confident, but there was an undeniable sincerity beneath the teasing. Sienna exhaled, trying to ignore the curious glances from her fellow crew members. She had no doubt they were wondering why one of the wealthiest men in the country was openly flirting with her. Still, she had a job to do. "If you're planning to be a regular passenger, I hope you've gotten over your fear of flying." Callum's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flashing in his eyes. "I wouldn't say I'm cured, but I trust you'll keep me distracted if necessary." She shook her head, fighting a smile. "I'll check on you later, Mr. Anderson." His lips quirked at the formality, but he didn't push. As the flight progressed, Sienna did her best to focus on her duties, but Callum was a distraction she couldn't ignore. Every time she passed by, she felt his eyes on her, his presence an undeniable force in the cabin. When turbulence hit, she instinctively glanced toward him. He was gripping the armrest, his jaw tight, but he wasn't panicked. Instead, he was watching her, as if grounding himself through her presence. She moved to his side without hesitation, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're doing better this time." His fingers relaxed slightly. "Because you're here." Something in her chest tightened. She should have brushed off the comment, kept things light and professional, but the way he said it low, certain made it impossible. After the flight landed, Sienna expected Callum to disappear into his world of boardrooms and luxury cars, but he lingered near the jet bridge, waiting for her. "Dinner again?" he asked, his gaze steady. She hesitated. Everything about this was moving fast, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what it meant. But then she remembered how she felt in his present scene, wanted, like she mattered beyond just being another person passing through his orbit. "All right," she said, her voice softer than she intended. Callum's expression warmed, and he extended a hand as if sealing an agreement. She didn't take it, not yet. Instead, she walked past him, glancing over her shoulder only once. "Don't be late," she called. He chuckled, shaking his head. "I wouldn't dare." And just like that, she knew she was in trouble. Sienna wasn't sure when she had stopped thinking of Callum Anderson as the nervous passenger in seat 3A and had started seeing him as something more, something dangerous, something impossible to resist. What began as casual dinners had turned into late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. A man who had once been a stranger on her flight was now the person she thought about in quiet moments between flights, the one whose voice she found herself longing to hear when the world quieted around her. Callum never demanded her time, never pressured her, but he made it clear he wanted her in his life, and that terrified her, because she wanted him too, but their worlds were so different. She spent her days in the skies, moving from city to city, while he was rooted in a world of wealth and power she couldn't begin to understand. Yet none of that seemed to matter when she was with him. One evening, after she landed from a long-haul flight, she received a message from him. No words, just an address. Curious, she followed the location to a private rooftop in the heart of Manhattan. The moment she stepped out of the elevator, she was met with a breathtaking sight: twinkling lights draped across the railing, a table set for two, and Callum standing there, waiting for her. He had always looked effortlessly put together, but tonight, there was something different about him. His usual suits had been replaced with a more relaxed look, sleeves rolled up, collar undone. And his eyes, the ones that had once been filled with anxiety on that first flight, were now filled with something else entirely. Something meant only for her. "I wanted to give you a little piece of the sky," he said, gesturing to the open rooftop view. "Since you spend so much time in it." Sienna's heart clenched. No one had ever done something like this for her before. She stepped closer, feeling the warmth of his presence. "You do realize this is ridiculous, right?" she teased. "A private rooftop dinner, this is straight out of a movie." Callum's expression softened. "Maybe, but you deserve to be treated like this." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent years taking care of others, soothing nervous passengers, handling demanding schedules, always putting herself second. And now, here was a man who wanted to make sure she was the one being taken care of. They sat down to dinner, the city stretching out beneath them, the world quiet for a moment. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did, but there was something unspoken lingering between them. Finally, Callum set his glass down and leaned forward. "Sienna, I need to ask you something." She met his gaze, her stomach twisting. "Go ahead." He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I know your life is up in the air literally, and I know I can't ask you to change that. But I don't want to be just another stop along the way for you." Her breath caught. "Callum, I'm not asking you to give anything up," he said quickly. "I just want to know if you see us as something real, because I do." The vulnerability in his voice nearly shattered her. He wasn't the billionaire in this moment. He wasn't the man who commanded boardrooms and made decisions that affected thousands. He was just Callum. The man who had once been terrified of flying, who had held onto her hand like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. She reached across the table, her fingers closing over his. "I see it," she admitted softly, "and it scares me." His grip tightened just slightly. "Me too." They sat in silence for a moment, the city lights flickering around them, the air thick with everything left unspoken. Finally, Callum exhaled. "Then let's figure it out together." Sienna nodded, knowing there was no turning back now. Because she was already falling, Sienna had never been one to lose herself in romance. Her life had always been defined by movement, boarding planes, crossing time zones, never staying in one place long enough for anything permanent. But Callum had a way of making her feel anchored, like maybe, for the first time, she didn't have to keep drifting. Their nights together became something she looked forward to. Stolen moments between flights, quiet dinners in hidden corners of the city where the rest of the world didn't exist. Callum never pushed, never asked her to slow down, but his presence was steady, unwavering in a way that made her feel safe. One evening, after a long shift, she found herself standing outside his penthouse, exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. She hadn't told him she was coming, and yet, when he opened the door, he didn't look surprised. "You're here," he said softly. She exhaled, stepping inside, letting the warmth of his home wrap around her. The place was sleek, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering city below. But it wasn't the view that made her breath catch, it was the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "I didn't want to be anywhere else," she admitted. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Then stay." The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. She wanted to, more than anything, but before she could respond, his phone buzzed on the nearby table. He glanced at it, his expression hardening for the briefest moment. Sienna pulled back slightly. "Is everything okay?" Callum hesitated, then picked up the phone, reading whatever message had just come through. A muscle in his jaw tensed. "It's nothing," he said, but she could tell it wasn't. She stepped closer, studying him. "Callum," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's work. A board member stirring up issues with one of our acquisitions. It's nothing I can't handle." She wasn't sure if she believed that, but she nodded anyway. He set the phone down, turning back to her, his expression softening. "I don't want to talk about business right now, I just want to be here with you." And just like that, the tension between them melted away. They spent the night curled up on his couch, the city lights flickering outside as they talked about everything and nothing. He told her stories about his childhood, about the pressure of taking over a company when he was barely out of college. She told him about the first time she had ever been on a plane, how it had felt like magic, how she had known then that the skies were where she belonged. At some point she must have fallen asleep, because when she woke up the sun was peeking through the windows and she was wrapped in Callum's arms. For the first time in a long time she didn't feel like she had to be anywhere else, but reality had a way of creeping back in. A few days later, she was preparing for another long-haul flight when she overheard two passengers whispering as they boarded. "Did you see the news about Callum Anderson?" one of them murmured. Her entire body went still. She turned slightly, keeping her expression neutral as she listened. "He's apparently in the middle of some major corporate takeover," the other person said. "Rumors are flying about him stepping down as CEO." Sienna's stomach twisted. She hadn't seen Callum in 48 hours. He had been distant, his responses to her messages shorter than usual. She had assumed it was just work keeping him busy, but now she wasn't so sure. The flight passed in a blur. By the time she landed, she had made up her mind. She needed to see him. When she arrived at his office, she barely had to say his name before the receptionist was leading her upstairs. Callum was standing by the window when she stepped into his office, his posture tense. He turned when he heard her, and for a moment, something unreadable flashed in his eyes. "You found out," he said quietly. Sienna crossed her arms. "From passengers on my flight, actually," he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was going to tell you." "When?" His silence was answer enough. Her chest ached. "Callum, why didn't you just talk to me?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Because I didn't want this to touch you. My life, this world, it can get messy, and you don't deserve to be pulled into it." She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. "That's not your decision to make." Something in him cracked then. He reached for her, his hands framing her face. "I don't want to lose you, Sienna," her breath caught. "Then don't push me away." For a long moment they just stood there, the weight of everything between them pressing down. Then finally Callum exhaled, his forehead resting against hers. "Stay," he whispered, and this time she did. Sienna had spent her life moving, never staying in one place long enough to let roots settle, never allowing herself to believe in permanence. But as she stood in Callum's office, his hands warm against her skin, she realized something had changed. She wasn't running anymore. Callum had tried to push her away, convinced that his world was too chaotic for her, but she wasn't fragile. She had spent her career navigating turbulence, both in the sky and in life, and she wasn't about to let fear his or hers dictate what they could be together. His forehead rested against hers, the weight of his unspoken fears pressing between them. She could feel the tension in his body, the war he was fighting within himself. "You don't have to do this alone," she whispered. A slow exhale left his lips, his grip tightening on her waist. "I've always had to." "Not anymore," she murmured. The words settled between them, something shifting in his expression. Callum Anderson was used to carrying the world on his shoulders, used to making decisions that affected thousands. But here now he wasn't the powerful CEO. He was just a man who needed someone to stand beside him, not walk away. His hands slid to her back, pulling her closer as his lips brushed against her temple. "Stay tonight," she nodded, feeling the last of her hesitation melt away. That night, they didn't talk about business, about the future, about anything outside of the quiet sanctuary they had built between them. They moved together like two halves of a whole, as if the universe had been leading them to this moment from the very beginning. When morning came, Sienna woke to the soft glow of sunrise filtering through the curtains. Callum was already awake, his arm draped over her waist, his gaze steady as he watched her. "You're staring," she murmured, stretching slightly against him. He didn't look away. "I'm memorizing." Her breath hitched at the quiet intensity in his voice. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about where she needed to be next. She was exactly where she belonged, but life had a way of testing even the strongest foundations. Over the next few weeks, Callum's business troubles escalated. Rumors of corporate takeovers became reality, board members questioning his leadership, the weight of an empire pressing down on him. And through it all, Sienna stayed. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes after long meetings, the way his shoulders tensed under the pressure. He never complained, never asked for help, but she saw it. One evening, she found him in his penthouse office, staring out at the city with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're thinking too much," she said softly, stepping behind him. He turned slightly, giving her a small, tired smile. "Occupational hazard." She moved closer, resting her hands against his chest. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Callum. You've built something incredible, and no one can take that away from you." His fingers trailed along her arm, his touch grounding. "I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing." "You are," she assured him. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's do something reckless." She raised an eyebrow. "Reckless how?" He took her hand, pulling her toward the door. "Come with me." An hour later, they stood in front of a sleek private jet, the engines humming softly in the background. Sienna stared at him, incredulous. "You're kidnapping me," Callum chuckled, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Not quite. I just figured you spend so much time flying for work you deserve to fly for yourself for once." She shook her head, laughter bubbling in her chest. "And where exactly are we going?" He leaned in, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "Anywhere you want." Her heart swelled. For once, she wasn't the one taking people places. This time, someone was taking her. They landed in a coastal town, the salty air mixing with the warmth of the sun. Callum had planned everything: secluded beaches, small hidden cafes, quiet moments where the rest of the world didn't exist. And somewhere between stolen kisses and whispered promises, Sienna realized she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid of change. She wasn't afraid of staying. She was in love. On their last evening there, Callum took her hand and led her to a quiet spot overlooking the ocean. The sky was painted in hues of gold and crimson, waves crashing gently in the distance. He turned to her, something unreadable in his gaze. "Sienna." She tilted her head, sensing the shift in his tone. "What is it?" He exhaled slowly, as if steadying himself. "I've spent my entire life chasing success, building something that I thought would make me happy. But none of it means anything if I don't have you." Her breath caught. Callum reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. She gasped softly, her hands flying to her lips. "I don't want to wait," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't want to spend another second wondering what life would be like without you in it, so I'm asking, stay with me. Marry me." Tears blurred her vision, but she was already nodding before he even finished speaking. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. Yes, Callum, relief, joy, pure love flashed across his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he kissed her, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise. The wedding was small, intimate, just them and the people who truly mattered. Sienna had never imagined herself in a white dress, had never pictured a forever that wasn't constantly moving. But as she stood across from Callum, his hands wrapped around hers, she knew she had found her home. The vows were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through, every moment that had led them here. And when Callum kissed her, sealing their future together, she knew this was only the beginning.